St. Michael's Hospital in San Antonio smelled of antiseptic and floor wax under fluorescent lights that hummed at 120 Hz, a sound that had become the soundtrack to Laura Bennett's careful disappearance. 8 months. 243 days since she'd signed the civilian intake paperwork with a name that wasn't hers, or rather, was hers now, the one the Pentagon had assigned when they erased the other one. She moved through the trauma wing's corridors with economical precision, no wasted motion, her scrubs always pressed, her badge clipped exactly level with her sternum. The scars on her forearms, thin white lines she never explained when residents noticed them, caught the fluorescent light when she checked fours or adjusted a central line. Laura didn't explain things. Explanation required conversation. Conversation required connection. Connection required the risk that someone might recognize the way her hands moved through trauma protocols, the particular muscle memory in her shoulders when she turned a patient, the specific angle she used when inserting a needle, movements that didn't come from civilian nursing school but from 4 years of field medicine in places the government had ordered her never to mention again. The jacket hung in her locker, the one she'd worn on the transport plane home. Olive drab, faded from desert sun and dust storms. Inside the lining, sewn with careful stitches at 2 a.m. in her apartment, was a patch. 1st Armored Division. Old Guard. She touched it every morning before her shift, a ritual that took 3 seconds and meant everything. Her fingers found the raised stitching like braille, like a prayer, like a promise to someone buried too deep to keep his name. Then she tucked her shirt in and became a nurse named Laura Bennett, 40 hours a week, 2 weeks of vacation she never took, a 401k she'd probably never live long enough to collect. The intercom crackled at 6:22 a.m. Incoming trauma. IED victim, multiple shrapnel wounds to thoracic cavity, en route 3 minutes. The emergency department exploded into choreography, nurses moving to trauma bay 2, respiratory checking ventilators, surgery prepping the OR. Laura stood at the nurse's station and read the incoming report on the computer screen without moving. 26-year-old male. Staff Sergeant Kyle Morrison. U.S. Army. Medic. Injuries sustained outside Ramadi during convoy operations. Laura's breath didn't change. Her expression didn't change. The trembling wasn't fear. The trembling was restraint, her hands gripping the edge of the desk with exactly enough pressure to leave 5 small marks in her palms that would fade within an hour. Kyle Morrison. Not Kyle. Sergeant Morrison. The one who'd replaced her. The medic who was doing the job that had been hers before the Black Ops extraction went sideways, before 8 soldiers stopped breathing, before the Pentagon had looked her in the eye and said your service record is being classified as never occurred and here is your new identity, and if you ever mention Ramadi to another living person, the people we report to will ensure you disappear in a way that makes your previous life look like a vacation. She released the desk. Picked up the incoming report. Walked toward Trauma Bay 2 at the exact pace of a nurse who knew what she was doing but wasn't about to break protocol with urgency. Muscle memory. The term floated through her mind like something observed from a great distance. The door slid open and she stepped into the bay, where 3 nurses were already positioning equipment and a respiratory tech was checking the mechanical ventilator's inflation pressure. The stretcher came through 30 seconds later, paramedics moving in tight synchronization, calling out vitals in the practiced staccato of people who'd done this 100 times. The man on the stretcher had shrapnel embedded in his chest like some kind of mechanical rose garden, his breathing shallow, his face the color of old newspaper. But his eyes opened when they transferred him to the hospital bed, and for exactly 1 second, those eyes found Laura's face. The recognition didn't happen. Not yet. He was too far gone into shock, pupils dilated, consciousness fractured. But something flickered. Something in the way he looked at her, not seeing her, not really, but sensing her presence the way animals sense predators. Laura's hands moved through the rapid assessment without thought. Pulse oximeter on his left index finger. Blood pressure cuff around his right arm. 12 lead EKG leads placed with practiced efficiency. 2-4 lines, 18 gauge, green needle glint catching the overhead lights. She spoke to the paramedics in the clipped shorthand of professionals, voice neutral, asking about fluid administration and pain medication as if she was reading a script she'd memorized years ago. Because she had. Because there was a time when this was her job, when she wore a uniform instead of scrubs, when her hands knew the difference between a tension pneumothorax and a simple pneumothorax before any monitor could tell her, when she'd looked at men like Kyle Morrison and seen brothers instead of strangers. Bed 3, the trauma surgeon said, pointing. Dr. Reeves, competent, kind, not the kind of person who looked for threats in his own staff. Get him prepped. We're going straight to surgery if his pressure holds. Laura nodded and began the preparation with Morrison's stretcher, moving him into bed 3 with the kind of smooth coordination that came from having done it approximately 8,000 times. Her hands adjusted his position, checked his foresights, confirmed the oxygen flow on his nasal cannula at 4 liters per minute. Around her, the bay moved in its organized chaos, respiratory therapy doing their thing, nurses calling out findings, the organized symphony of people who knew exactly what they were doing. She watched Morrison's chest rise and fall, watched the monitors track his vital signs, watched the way his eyes rolled behind closed lids as consciousness slipped further away. The bandages they'd placed in the field were soaked through with blood that had already started to brown at the edges, the plasma beginning to separate from the cellular material. He needed surgery. He needed a surgeon better than the one she'd been forced to work with in Ramadi. He needed luck. The doors to the trauma bay slid open again, and Dr. Pierce walked in like he owned the room. He did, technically. At least in his own mind. 38 years old, married to a surgical resident he'd met at Johns Hopkins, father of 2 children whose photos he kept on his desk next to framed articles about his research. Head of the trauma department, or close enough to feel the weight of authority on his shoulders. He'd been watching Laura since her first day, his eyes tracking the way she moved, the particular competence in her gestures, the fact that she never seemed to second-guess herself, never asked permission before doing what clearly needed doing. It made him uncomfortable in a way he couldn't quite articulate, like someone had rearranged the furniture in his house and he couldn't figure out why it bothered him until he realized what was missing was his sense of being the most competent person in any given room. Rapid sequence intubation, Pierce said, not asking but commanding. His voice was the kind that expected obedience, the kind that had been shaped by years of resident fear and institutional hierarchy. Get me a number 8 tube. Laura, start a second line. We need 2 access points before surgery. Laura was already moving toward the 4 kit, her hand selecting the supplies with the economy of motion that came from knowing exactly what she needed before needing it. Another 18 gauge, the kit already open on the bedside table, the tourniquet going around Morrison's other arm in one fluid motion. His skin was cool and clammy, the veins collapsed from shock, demanding the kind of blind insertion that took either luck or experience. She found the basilic vein on the first attempt, the needle sliding in smooth as silk, blood filling the hub, the line advancing without resistance. She secured it with tape and grabbed the saline flush, clearing the line with economical movements. Pierce watched her, his jaw tightening almost imperceptibly. The way she'd done that. The way she knew where the vein would be without searching. The way her hands moved like they were following a map only she could see. He'd seen that kind of precision before, in operating rooms where surgeons had spent 20 years perfecting their craft. Not in a nurse. Especially not in a nurse who seemed to spend her time trying to be invisible. Good, he said, the word coming out clipped. Not praise. Not quite. Something closer to acknowledgement, the way a general might acknowledge that a soldier had followed orders correctly. He turned to the respiratory therapist. It's CO2 monitor on the end tidal. I want to see his numbers climbing as soon as we get tube placement. The intubation proceeded smoothly. Dr. Reeves arrived, mask on, hands already in the first stages of preparation. The crash team congealed around Morrison's bed like cells forming a tissue, each person knowing their role, each person trusting that everyone else knew theirs. Laura stood at the patient's head, managing his airway while the emergency medicine resident drew labs and the nurses confirmed that surgery was ready, that the operating room on the 3rd floor had a surgical team standing by, that Morrison's trajectory was now out of their hands and in the hands of a trauma surgeon who'd seen something like this before and had the skill set to fix it. The next words Pierce said changed everything. Not because they were loud. Not because they were dramatic. But because he said them while looking directly at Laura, his eyes searching her face for something he couldn't quite name. "Who taught you to place a line like that?" Laura didn't pause. She didn't hesitate. She simply continued adjusting the flow rate and said 4 words in a voice so quiet it nearly disappeared into the background noise of monitors and ventilators. EMT certification. Paramedic refresher. It was a lie so smooth and practiced that it almost tasted like truth. Almost. Pierce's eyes narrowed by exactly the amount of space that meant he didn't quite believe her, but he also didn't quite have cause to challenge her. The moment passed like a bird flying through a room, there and then gone, leaving only the sense that something had been present and was no longer. "Get him upstairs," Pierce said, his attention already pivoting to his next task, his next assertion of control. "I want full imaging before they crack his chest. Chest X-ray, CT angiogram, fast exam. Let's confirm what we're dealing with." The trauma team moved Morrison toward the elevator, the nurses pushing the stretcher with practiced efficiency, the monitor riding on the bed frame, the 4 lines secured and labeled. Laura stood at the bedside for one more moment, her hand on the rail, watching the man who'd replaced her disappear into the machinery of institutional medicine. His eyes were closed. His breathing was mechanical. His chest rose and fell in perfect synchronization with the ventilator, the machine doing what lungs should do, what her lungs had once needed to do after the explosion, before the Pentagon had decided she was classified and required erasure. She released the rail, turned toward the supply station, began restocking the trauma bay with the methodical precision of someone who understood that the work never ended, that there would always be another patient, another emergency, another moment when the line between life and death came down to knowing exactly where to put a needle and trusting your hands to remember what your mind was no longer permitted to know. But something had shifted. In the moment when Morrison's eyes had found her face, in the moment when Pierce had watched her hands move with muscle memory she couldn't quite suppress, something had broken in the careful architecture of her disappearance. The patch inside her jacket lining suddenly felt heavier. The name on her badge suddenly felt thinner. The fluorescent lights continued their 120 Hz hum, and Laura Bennett continued her shift, and somewhere on the 3rd floor, the surgical team was preparing to extract pieces of metal from a man who should never have been in her hospital at all. The name on her badge suddenly felt thinner. The fluorescent lights continued their 120 Hz hum, and Laura Bennett continued her shift, and somewhere on the 3rd floor, the surgical team was preparing to extract pieces of metal from a man who should never have been in her hospital at all. Thursday morning brought Dr. Pierce to grand rounds with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. The trauma wing residents gathered in the conference room, coffee cups warming their hands, ambitious smiles warming their faces. Pierce pulled up Laura's chart notes on the projector, meticulous documentation, thorough assessments, the kind of notes that demonstrated clinical reasoning most attending physicians took years to develop. He tapped the screen with his laser pointer like he was marking targets. "Let's discuss dangerous freelancing by undertrained staff," he said, his voice carrying that particular contempt reserved for people he'd already decided were beneath him. "Ms. Bennett here has decided that her 8 months of floor experience qualifies her to make clinical decisions typically reserved for physicians." The residents smirked on cue, their laughter the sound of wolves recognizing weakness in the herd. Laura stood against the back wall, her posture relaxed, her face an unreadable mask. Her hands were clasped loosely at her waist. Not a single muscle moved. Not a blink. Not a breath that came any faster than the last one. Pierce continued, his confidence growing with each syllable. "Note how she's documented interventions without consulting the attending. See this notation here? She adjusted the patient sedation protocol based on clinical observation. This is what happens when we let glorified pill dispensers forget their place." He turned to face the residents directly now, his back to Laura. "The nursing board has clear scope limitations. Ms. Bennett would do well to remember them." One of the residents, a 3rd year named Patterson, raised his hand slightly. "But her assessments are solid. The patient outcomes." "Outcome bias," Pierce interrupted, his voice sharp as a scalpel. Just because something didn't go wrong doesn't mean the approach was appropriate. We maintain standards here. We don't let floor staff practice medicine. Laura's jaw tightened. Imperceptibly. A quarter-inch clench that someone watching for it might have noticed, but Pierce wasn't watching. He was performing. He was establishing dominance in front of an audience, and Laura was just a prop in his theater. She turned slightly, her eyes tracking the monitor displays visible through the conference room windows, her mind already on the 3 patients in the trauma wing who needed her attention more than this needed her presence. The meeting dissolved. Pierce moved through the hallways like he was conducting rounds on his personal estate, and the residents dispersed like courtiers. Laura stayed behind for 30 seconds, straightening the chairs that didn't need straightening, buying time, controlling her exhale the way she'd controlled it 100 times before in situations where showing emotion meant showing weakness. By Friday afternoon, the real work began. Pierce cornered her at the 3rd-floor vending machine during the shift change rush. He'd timed it perfectly, nurses and techs streaming past, creating an audience without creating the formality of an official confrontation. Laura was reaching for her usual black coffee, the kind that had gone cold in every break room across 3 states, when his shadow fell across the machine. "Someone with your limited education," he said, loudly enough for the passing staff to hear, "really shouldn't be handling critical cases." His voice was measured, conversational, the tone of someone discussing the weather. That made it worse. That made it calculated. "You're a liability, Nightingale. One more instance of you practicing medicine without a license, and I'll have security escort you out personally. Do we understand each other?" The nickname hung in the air like a curse. Nightingale. Florence Nightingale. The implication was clear, a legendary nurse was impossible. What stood before him was just a competent floor nurse who'd forgotten her limitations. The surrounding staff pretended not to hear, but they heard. They all heard. The message wasn't really for Laura anyway. It was for them. It was establishing the hierarchy. It was establishing what happened to people who threatened Dr. Pierce's authority. Laura picked up her coffee with steady hands. Her trembling wasn't fear. It was restraint. The kind of restraint that came from knowing exactly what you were capable of and choosing not to do it. She met his eyes with no expression whatsoever, read the expectation in his face. He wanted to see fear, wanted to see shame, wanted to see tears or anger or anything that would confirm he'd broken something. She gave him nothing. She turned and walked back to her station without a single word, her pace measured, her shoulders level, her face a perfectly executed mask. Behind her, Pierce smiled. He'd won. He didn't realize he was standing next to victory, not defeat. He didn't understand that silence from someone like Laura wasn't acquiescence. It was the sound of someone storing information. It was the sound of someone deciding how many more insults she could absorb before that particular equation became unsustainable. Inside her chest, something cold and familiar settled into place. The feeling of being erased while still breathing. The feeling she'd known before, in a compound in Ramadi, where official reports said she was never there and official records said the operation never happened. She'd been erased once already. The practice made it easier the second time. That evening, Pierce made his strategic moves. His hands moved across the staffing schedule like a general repositioning troops. He reassigned the 2 most experienced techs from the trauma wing, Chen and Rodriguez, both competent, both people who'd worked seamlessly with Laura for 8 months, to the surgical floors. He called in favor from the night shift supervisor and had himself scheduled as the covering attending for the weekend, ensuring he'd personally oversee any decisions Laura made. Then he picked up his phone and called the HR director, a woman named Sarah Meadows who'd been his resident 3 years ago. "Sarah, I need to discuss a pattern we're seeing on the floor," he said, his voice the picture of concerned professionalism. "One of the nurses, Laura Bennett, has shown consistent tendency toward overstepping her scope. I'm documenting it formally, but I wanted to give you a heads up. I suspect we may need to initiate a corrective action plan." He paused. "Actually, between you and me, I'm questioning her fitness for the position. But I want to be fair. Let's see how the next couple of weeks go. It was brilliant. It was strategic. It was the work of a competent antagonist who understood institutional power. He'd poisoned the HR waters without making an accusation. He'd established a paper trail. He'd isolated her from experienced support. And he'd positioned himself as her direct supervisor, which meant every decision she made would be reviewed through a lens of suspicion. Laura didn't know any of this yet. She was in bed 3, monitoring Staff Sergeant Kyle Morrison, watching the patterns in his vital signs the way she'd watched patterns in hostile territory. Morrison drifted in and out of medicated sleep, his breathing shallow and regular, the kind of breathing that came from a man whose body was still processing the trauma of shrapnel and surgery and the understanding that he was alive only because someone had made the right decision at the right moment. At one point during her 11 p.m. rounds, she paused at his bedside. His vitals were stable, his oxygen saturation good, his pain controlled by the morphine drip. She studied the imaging results documented in his chart, the scatter signature of a pressure plate IED, the signature she recognized from a particular industrial district in Ramadi, November 2009, a patrol that should never have gone that direction. She knew that signature the way a hunter knows the track of a specific animal. Her hand drifted to her pocket where her jacket hung in her locker downstairs, where that patch lay hidden in the lining. The faded 1st Armored Division patch. The patch that represented a life the government had ordered her to erase. The patch that was the only physical proof that Captain Laura Bennett had ever existed. Morrison's eyes opened briefly, catching her profile in the dim light. His pupils focused with that particular intensity of someone accessing a memory through the fog of anesthesia. Something flickered in his recognition, something ancient and familiar, before sleep pulled him under again and his breathing returned to its medicated rhythm. Laura's hand dropped. She documented his vitals and moved to the next bed, and the next one after that, the mechanical efficiency of her movements a kind of meditation, a way of keeping the cold thing in her chest from expanding outward. By 1 a.m., the trauma wing was quiet in the way that only hospitals are quiet, a silence underneath constant sound, the hiss of ventilators, the soft beep of monitors, the distant echo of a television from someone's room, the fluorescent lights with their 120 Hz hum that nobody else could hear but Laura heard every single night. She sat in the break room, staring at a cup of coffee that had gone cold 2 hours ago. Her phone was in her hand, the contact list open, 12 names, all civilian now, all scattered across the country with new identities and strict orders never to contact each other. The government had been very clear about one thing: Operation Sandstorm never happened. The compound in Ramadi never existed. Captain Laura Bennett died in official silence. She was a ghost before she became a nurse. She was a ghost who wasn't permitted to haunt anything, including her own life. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that Morrison was here. The medic who'd replaced her in Ramadi. The medic who was now doing the job that had once been hers, lying in bed 3 with shrapnel scattered through his chest from an IED that had torn through his convoy, and she was standing guard over him the way she'd stood guard over that compound, and nobody understood the weight of that, nobody could understand that the universe was a small and terrible place where ghosts were expected to keep working. At 1:06 a.m., Morrison's monitor began chirping irregularly. Laura was on her feet instantly, crossing the wing in 3 seconds, her eyes reading the telemetry before she reached his bedside. His respiratory rate was climbing, 24, 26, 28. His oxygen saturation was dropping in real time, 94, 92, 89. His trachea was deviating to the left, a subtle shift visible in the way his neck positioned itself. Tension pneumothorax. The shrapnel had shifted during sleep, puncturing his lung, and air was filling his chest cavity, collapsing the lung and shifting his heart. She had maybe 3 minutes before he arrested. Maybe less. The night shift at St. Michael's began like all the others, fluorescent lights humming their endless mechanical prayer, the trauma wing settling into that particular kind of quiet that only hospitals know. Laura moved through Morrison's room at 10 o'clock, checking the 4 lines with the same methodical precision she'd learned in field medicine, watching his vitals the way she'd once watched convoy routes for ambush points. The monitors beeped their steady rhythm. 78, 82, 85. Normal. Safe. Morrison drifted in and out of medicated sleep, his chest wrapped tight, the shrapnel wounds beginning their slow process of healing. She'd been assigned to the night shift exclusively after Dr. Pierce had suggested to the charge nurse that Laura's limited qualifications made her unsuitable for complex daytime cases. The isolation suited her. The quiet suited her. After 8 months of swallowing humiliation in hallways and break rooms, the night shift felt like mercy. She sat at the monitoring station just outside his door, her eyes never leaving the screens, when the clock read 2:07 a.m. Morrison's chest suddenly went rigid. Not the subtle tension of a man dreaming, but the violent, involuntary contraction of someone suffocating from the inside. His oxygen saturation plummeted. 85. 79. 72. The monitor began to accelerate its beeping, a sound like a bird caught in machinery, and Laura was moving before conscious thought completed itself. Muscle memory took over. The kind that survives in bone and nerve after 2 tours in Ramadi, after holding Morrison's predecessor's hand while he bled out on a phi base, after learning that speed and precision were the only languages that mattered when a man's lungs were collapsing inward. Tension pneumothorax. The diagnosis arrived in her mind complete and certain. Air trapped between the lung and chest wall, building pressure, collapsing the lung, kinking the vena cava, strangling the heart. He had maybe 90 seconds before cardiac arrest. Laura moved to the crash cart, her hands already reaching for the decompression needle kit before her conscious mind had fully articulated the plan. 14-gauge angiocath needle. Second intercostal space, midclavicular line. 1 smooth motion. That's all it would take. She'd done this before. She'd done this at night, in the dark, with mortar rounds landing 50 meters away and blood making the ground slick. She'd done this while people screamed. Morrison's oxygen saturation hit 68. The alarm shrieked now, pulling every conscious thought toward crisis. And then Dr. Pierce appeared in the doorway like a man emerging from a fever dream, his white coat still crisp from home, his eyes moving from Morrison to Laura with a predatory calculation that had nothing to do with medicine and everything to do with territory. "Step away from my patient, Bennett." His voice cut through the alarm noise with the precision of someone accustomed to obedience. He'd been in his office reviewing charts, she realized later. He'd heard the monitor alarm across the unit and recognized it as his opportunity. He'd been waiting for a moment like this since she started, waiting for her to overstep, waiting for her to confirm every suspicion he harbored about her competence. Laura turned, the needle still in her hand. "He has a tension pneumothorax. He needs decompression now. Less than 2 minutes." She spoke the words like a clinical statement, like reading a chart, like a nurse briefing a doctor. But something in the precision of her voice, the absence of deference, the absence of apology, the absence of any inflection that suggested she was asking permission, made Dr. Pierce's jaw tighten. "I said step away," Pierce repeated, and this time he didn't just speak the words. He moved his body between her and Morrison's bed, his hands already fumbling with the crash cart, pulling out a needle that was too large, too blunt, wrong. His movements betrayed him immediately, the hesitation, the searching, the way he had to look at the equipment like it might betray him at any moment. This was a man who'd never held a needle like this in a real crisis. He'd practiced on simulation torsos in conferences. He'd watched videos. He'd read the protocols. But he'd never felt a real chest wall give way beneath his hand or heard the actual sound of air escaping from a human body or watched color return to a patient's lips as the pressure released. Morrison's oxygen saturation dropped to 55. His body began to seize. "Doctor, he has less than 2 minutes," Laura said, and her voice remained level, professional, devoid of any challenge. This was the voice of a person who understood the weight of protocol and the absolute tyranny of institutional hierarchy. But it was also the voice of someone who had held dying men in her arms. The two voices existed simultaneously in her throat, and only those trained enough to listen could hear both of them. Pierce's face flushed red, the color spreading from his neck upward like an infection. "Are you questioning my clinical judgment?" he demanded, and in that moment, he believed that he was. He believed that his authority superseded Lauren's competence. He believed that his title made him correct. 51%. Morrison's eyes rolled back, the whites showing, his body already moving toward that threshold from which not all patients returned. Laura didn't ask permission again. She didn't step back. She moved forward, and when Pierce tried to position himself between them again, when he tried to maintain his territorial claim over a patient suffering, she shoved past him. The first physical action she'd taken in 8 months of swallowing humiliation, 8 months of accepting dismissal with nothing more than a jaw clench and a held breath. She moved like a woman who'd been trained in field medicine by the United States Army, who'd survived 3 combat tours, who'd learned that hesitation in a crisis cost lives. Pierce stumbled backward, his hand knocking against the four-pole, surprise and fury warring across his face. Laura positioned herself at Morrison's bedside. Her hands moved with the terrifying fluid precision of someone for whom this procedure was written in muscle memory. Second intercostal space. Midclavicular line. She found the landmarks by feel alone, by the knowledge encoded in her fingertips from 100 practice repetitions and 12 real-world applications. The needle went in perpendicular, pushing through skin, through fascia, through the pleural lining, until it found the pressurized air trapped between lung and ribs. The hiss of escaping air was immediate, loud, almost violent in its release. The sound of a wound exhaling. The sound of pressure finding its way out. Morrison's chest wall relaxed visibly. His breathing deepened. Color returned to his lips, starting at the edges and spreading outward like a sunrise. The oxygen saturation climbed. 55. 62. 70. 85. 92. Stable. For 5 seconds, there was only the sound of the monitor stabilizing and Morrison's ragged breathing and the fluorescent lights above humming their mechanical prayer. For 5 seconds, no one moved. Pierce stood against the wall, his chest heaving, his face the color of spilled wine, his hands still empty of any instrument or purpose. He watched Laura step back from the bed with the needle properly secured, watched her check Morrison's pupils, watched her make a note in the chart with the clinical certainty of someone who'd just saved a life and knew it. Then Pierce was on the phone. His voice had changed, no longer angry, but cold, calculated, strategic. "Yes, this is Dr. Pierce. I need to report a nurse performing unauthorized procedures on my patient. Gross insubordination. Scope of practice violation. I want her badge pulled immediately. Yes. Now." He spoke like a man who understood power, who knew how to weaponize institutions, who'd spent his career learning how to protect himself by destroying those beneath him. Laura listened to him make the call. She didn't interrupt. She didn't defend herself. She simply continued her nursing work, checking Morrison's vitals one more time, ensuring he was breathing adequately, making her notes. The composure held. The mask didn't slip. Not here. Not while anyone was watching. But that wasn't the worst part. Within 40 minutes, security arrived with that particular blank expression that comes from being asked to remove someone from a hospital without understanding the reason. They took her badge. They walked her to her locker while the night shift watched from doorways and corners, their faces a mixture of pity and fear, fear that could happen to any of them, fear of Dr. Pierce's power, fear of the arbitrariness of institutional destruction. By the time Laura had gathered her things, her stethoscope, her phone, the jacket with the faded 1st Armored Division patch sewn inside the lining, the one MacGuffin that proved she'd ever been captain at all, the chief of staff had been called at home. By 2:08 a.m., a preliminary suspension was signed. By 3:15 a.m., Laura sat in an empty diner on San Antonio's east side, the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead like the ones at St. Michael's, her coffee going cold in front of her, untouched. She stared at her reflection in the dark window, watching herself dissolve into nothing for the second time in her life. The first time, the Pentagon had ordered it officially. They'd sealed her service record, erased her name from the files, given her a civilian identity and instructions to disappear because officially, she'd never been in that compound in Ramadi where 8 soldiers had died. This time, it was the quiet machinery of hospital administration doing the work. This time, no one had even bothered to give her an official explanation. The phone was already in Dr. Pierce's hand before Morrison's oxygen saturation stabilized. Laura watched him from the corner of her vision while she confirmed the placement of the decompression needle, her fingers steady as she adjusted the flow rate, lactated ringers running wide open, Morrison's color returning from the ash gray of hypoxia to something approximating human. The hiss of escaping air had stopped. The monitors showed climbing numbers. 84. 87. 90. She exhaled through her nose and began documenting the procedure in precise medical language, her handwriting as controlled as her breathing, when she heard Pierce's voice cut across the trauma bay like a blade. "Yes, I need to report a serious incident." His tone was ice-smooth, the kind of calm that comes from certainty that you hold all the power. He was walking toward the corridor, his shoes clicking on the tile floor in a rhythm that matched his words. "A nurse on my trauma team performed an unauthorized invasive procedure on a patient under my care. A decompression needle. No physician oversight. Complete violation of scope of practice." Laura's jaw tightened imperceptibly. She continued documenting. Vital signs. Procedure time. Needle gauge and insertion point. Everything by the book, because the book was the only thing that mattered now. "I'm requesting immediate suspension pending investigation." Pierce's voice carried the tone of a man who'd made this call before and knew exactly which buttons to push. "Yes, I have witnesses. The entire trauma team saw this happen. No, I don't think we should wait for protocol review. This is a liability issue." The fluorescent lights hummed their constant drone overhead. Morrison was watching Laura, his eyes tracking her movements with the clarity of someone whose oxygen-deprived brain was finally getting what it needed. She didn't meet his gaze. She couldn't. Not now. By 3:15 a.m., security had her badge. The plastic rectangle was still warm from the scanner when they handed it to her, the small indignity of something that had opened doors for 8 months suddenly becoming inert in her palm. Officer Vasquez wouldn't meet her eyes either. He was a decent man doing a job he clearly didn't enjoy, his utility belt creaking as he shifted his weight. "They're waiting in HR," he said quietly. "Administrative leave pending the investigation outcome." The HR director was a thin woman named Caldwell who'd been one of Pierce's residents 3 years ago. Laura recognized the dynamic immediately, the way Caldwell's fingers moved across her keyboard with the mechanical precision of someone executing someone else's orders, the small flinch when she slid the termination papers across her desk. The words on the page were already printed: gross insubordination. Practicing beyond scope of practice. Unauthorized procedures. Immediate termination effective immediately. No severance pending investigation results. "I'm sorry," Caldwell said, and she actually meant it. Pierce went to the chief of staff directly. It was already decided before you even left the trauma bay." Laura signed the papers. Her signature was identical to the one on her civilian employment application 8 months ago, controlled, precise, the signature of someone who didn't exist. She placed the pen down on the desk and stood. The room was silent except for the hum of the building's ventilation system and the distant sound of an ambulance siren wailing toward the ER. "Your final paycheck will be mailed to your address on file," Caldwell continued, shuffling papers that didn't need shuffling. "We'll need your uniform shirts back within 14 days." Laura nodded once and walked out. Officer Vasquez didn't follow her to the exit. He knew she wasn't going to run. The diner on the east side of San Antonio was open 24 hours, the kind of place where the coffee was strong and no one asked questions. Laura sat in a booth facing the door, tactical position, old habit, and watched her reflection dissolve in the dark window outside. The cup of black coffee had gone cold an hour ago. The waitress had stopped offering refills after the 3rd time Laura declined. It was 3:11 a.m., which meant she'd been sitting there for 2 hours and 45 minutes, watching the civilian identity she'd carefully constructed over 8 months evaporate like heat shimmer off summer asphalt. Captain Laura Bennett had died in Ramadi 7 years ago. The Pentagon had made that official. The woman they'd pulled out of that compound had been given a new social security number, a false employment history, a nursing credential that was legitimate but disconnected from her actual training. The woman who worked at St. Michael's Hospital was supposed to be invisible. Clean background. No military records. No reason for anyone to look twice. And she'd been good at it. The quiet professionalism. The deference to doctors like Pierce, letting them believe their credentials and titles meant something when she was the one actually saving lives at 2 a.m. She'd taken his insults without flinching, his public humiliations without a word of protest, his dismissive contempt for her limited education with the kind of composure that came from having already survived worse than anything his words could inflict. But that was the old way. The way that kept her invisible. The way that protected the mission and the national security implications and the 8 soldiers whose names couldn't appear on casualty reports because officially they'd never existed either. Morrison was still alive because she'd moved faster than Pierce could block her. That wasn't invisible. That wasn't protocol. That was captain, and the moment her hands moved on their own, the moment muscle memory overrode every civilian rule she'd accepted, the countdown to this moment had been inevitable. She stared at her reflection in the dark window, the ghost of a woman who'd already died once, watching herself dissolve into nothing for the second time. The next morning was grey and humid, San Antonio heat already building even at 8:30 a.m. Laura walked back into St. Michael's through the staff entrance, and the security guard at the checkpoint, a different one, younger, checked his clipboard and found her name listed under terminated employees. He looked uncomfortable about it. She'd been polite to him on every shift. "I'm just here to collect my personal items from my locker," she said quietly. He nodded and called for an escort. That was protocol for terminated staff. Someone had to watch to make sure nothing was stolen, no patient files accessed, no final bridges burned. Officer Vasquez again, which was either kindness or just the luck of scheduling. They walked through the staff corridor in silence, her footsteps and his filling the quiet hallway. The break room was off to the left. The nurse's station was ahead. The trauma wing was beyond that. She was thinking about which of her uniforms she'd need to return and whether she could find another nursing job in the city without a reference from St. Michael's when the sound hit her first, not an explosion exactly, more like the world splitting open. The crack was sharp and sudden, followed immediately by the distinctive scatter sound of shrapnel hitting walls, glass shattering, the bass note rumble of a blast that moved through the building's structure like a wave. The trauma wing. Laura was moving before her conscious mind caught up, before Vasquez could react, her body remembering protocols that had nothing to do with hospital policy. She ran toward the sound, her shoes gripping tile, her breath controlled and economical. The trauma wing doors were sealed by automated systems. She shoved through them with her shoulder and stepped into chaos. Smoke hung in the air, acrid and chemical. The nurse's station was a scatter of debris, equipment torn from its moorings, the front of the counter blackened by blast concussion. A nurse was on the ground with blood pouring from a laceration on her scalp. Someone was screaming in one of the treatment bays. The sprinkler system was already activating, rain starting to fall inside the building. Morrison's room was directly adjacent to the blast point. The window was gone. The walls had been peppered with shrapnel, creating divots in the drywall and structural damage that made the room look like it had been attacked by an artillery round at close range. Morrison was trying to roll out of bed, his fours still connected, his surgical dressings tearing as he moved. His face was panicked, not the calm of a trained soldier, but the raw fear of someone whose body was still healing and whose instincts were screaming that the danger hadn't passed. Laura was at his bedside in 6 seconds. She could feel the heat from the blast still radiating from the walls. Secondary scatter of shrapnel was still falling, pieces of debris ricocheting through the open space where the window had been. She didn't think. She pivoted her body and threw herself across Morrison, covering him completely, her back exposed to the falling metal. The first fragment punched through her right shoulder blade with a sensation like being struck by a baseball bat. The impact drove the air from her lungs, but she didn't move. The second came from a different angle, tearing through her left side just below the ribs, hot and burning. A third caught the edge of her spine and glanced off, leaving a long gash that burned like fire. She stayed exactly where she was, her body a shield between Morrison and the debris, until the pieces stopped falling and the only sound was the sprinkler system raining down on both of them. Blood soaked through her scrubs, spreading in dark blooms across her back and side. The pain was information, a data point, a tactical assessment. Penetrating wounds, possibly one near the kidney, definitely one that had compromised muscle and possibly lung tissue. She could breathe, which meant the puncture wasn't catastrophic. The bleeding was manageable, which meant the arterial damage was minimal. Morrison was underneath her, protected entirely, his eyes opening to see her face inches from his. The angle was wrong. The scars visible on her neck and jaw in the strange light filtering through the damaged window. The way she'd moved, not like a nurse scrambling in panic, but like someone who'd moved 1,000 times under fire. The tactical precision of her coverage, placing herself to maximize his protection while minimizing her critical vulnerabilities. His pupils focused with sudden, complete recognition. His voice came out as a hoarse whisper, rough and certain, "Guardian." Laura's eyes widened fractionally, the first visible crack in 8 months of perfect composure. She'd been called by that call sign exactly twice since leaving Ramadi. Both times by ghosts. Both times by people who died or disappeared. Morrison's hand was already moving, reaching for the bedside drawer where he kept his personal items. His fingers found his phone, and he was dialing before the EMTs rushed in, before Laura could move, before anyone could stop him. His voice was already strengthening, the shock giving way to the clarity of purpose. "Gunny," he said into the phone, and his voice carried absolute certainty. "I need you to make some calls. Right now. I just found her. Ghost Company's captain. She's bleeding out at St. Michael's in San Antonio, and these people have no idea who they just fired." By the time they loaded Laura onto a gurney, her hands pressed against the wounds, maintaining pressure, staying conscious through sheer force of will, Morrison had made 3 calls. By the time they'd wheeled her into surgery and an attending physician was assessing the damage, those 3 calls had multiplied into a dozen. By the time the surgeons were closing the laceration near her kidney and confirming that the puncture wound through her side had missed her lung by less than a centimeter, 50 calls had been made. The message was traveling through networks that hadn't been activated in 7 years. The same networks that had extracted her from Ramadi. The same command structure that had given her a new identity and orders never to surface. Ghost Company. Platoon Guardian. The captain who'd held an aid station alone for 14 hours under direct fire while her entire team bled out around her. The message was simple: I found her. 20 minutes. That's all it took for the morning to become something else entirely. Laura had pushed through the ER entrance at 8:53 a.m., moving toward her locker with the kind of mechanical precision that comes after a sleepless night in a diner, watching your life dissolve into nothing for the second time. The badge that had once hung from her neck was gone. Security had it. HR had signed the termination papers. By legal standards, she wasn't even supposed to be in the building, but Morrison was still upstairs in bed 3, and she needed to retrieve the photograph that lived in the bottom of her locker, the only physical proof that Captain Laura Bennett had ever existed outside of classified Pentagon files. The ER was quiet. Too quiet. The kind of quiet that makes the fluorescent lights sound louder than they should, their electrical hum turning into something almost like a warning. Laura recognized the sound from Ramadi. The sound before everything changed. The discharge papers for the patient from the psychiatric ward had been processed at 8:43 a.m. Nobody had checked what he was carrying. Nobody had checked the canvas bag with the copper wiring visible at the seams, the kind of improvised device that smelled like diesel fuel and fertilizer and intent. He'd walked past 3 nurses. He'd walked past a resident. He'd walked straight toward the nurses' station near bed 3 because that was where the shift supervisor sat, the one who'd rejected his admission claim 3 days ago, who'd called him non-compliant and dangerous. The explosion happened at 8:58 a.m. The sound wasn't like anything in nature. Explosions in movies sound like thunder rolling across a sky. Real explosions sound like the world splitting open. The blast wave compressed the air in the ER like a fist closing around her chest. Laura was 3 seconds from her locker. She was 30 feet from Morrison's room. Her body made the decision before her mind caught up. She ran. Not toward the exit. Not toward safety. Toward bed 3, toward the patient who'd replaced her in Ramadi, toward the man whose eyes had opened in recognition the moment she disarmed the tension pneumothorax that would have killed him. The sound of her boots on tile echoed with the precision of muscle memory. 1, 2, 3, 4, the same rhythm she'd moved to in a forward operating base 8 years ago when the IED hit the convoy 3 blocks from the compound. Morrison saw her coming. His eyes widened, but his body stayed paralyzed by months of recovery, by the shrapnel still embedded in his chest that surgery had decided to leave rather than risk. Laura threw herself across his bed like a shield. Like something with wings and armor. Like something that had already survived the worst and decided survival was not negotiable. The shrapnel came through the window like hornets made of metal and velocity. It tore through her shoulder first, a line of fire that split sensation from thought. It ripped across her back in a pattern that felt like teeth, like something alive and angry. She felt the impact and the warmth spreading through her scrubs immediately, blood soaking through the fabric with that distinct copper smell that doesn't exist anywhere else in the world. Her body jerked once, twice, and then locked. Muscle memory held. Composure held. She did not scream. She did not flinch. She did not move from Morrison's body. The room went quiet except for the sound of glass still falling, that delicate chiming that sounds almost beautiful when you're bleeding through your clothes in a hospital bed that suddenly feels like a combat zone again. Morrison opened his eyes and looked directly at her face. His pupils were still dilated from the trauma, but they focused. Recognition moved through his expression like the sunrise, slow and then all at once. His lips moved. His voice came out as a whisper that carried more weight than a shout, "Guardian." She didn't respond. Couldn't respond. The pain was information. The bleeding was manageable. Morrison was alive. That was the only variable that mattered. The nurses screamed. The alarm started. Within 90 seconds, there were hands on Laura, moving her carefully off Morrison's bed, cutting away her scrubs, assessing the damage with the professional detachment of people who've seen worse. The shrapnel wounds covered her left shoulder and her entire back in a pattern that looked random until you understood the physics. She'd twisted her body to shield Morrison's head, his torso, his heart. She'd taken the impact that would have killed him. But Morrison wasn't looking at the nurses. He was looking at Laura as they wheeled her toward surgical assessment, and his hand moved toward his phone with the kind of urgency that comes from understanding exactly what you've just witnessed. Not a nurse. Not someone he'd met on her first day at St. Michael's Hospital 8 months ago. Captain Laura Bennett. Call sign Guardian. The officer who'd held an aid station alone for 14 hours under direct fire while her entire team bled out around her, the one the Pentagon had erased because the mission in Ramadi had gone sideways in ways that classified documents still wouldn't describe. The message Morrison sent from his hospital bed contained just 6 words, "Found Guardian." She found me. The phone started ringing within minutes. The first call reached a Marine gunnery sergeant named Clayton Mercer, who'd served under her in the 1st Armored Division and now worked recruitment for JSOC. The second call reached Colonel Marcus Halloway, who'd commanded her during Operation Sandstorm and still carried her image in his head from that forward operating base, the way her hands moved when she was working on a soldier, the calm in her voice under fire. The third call reached someone higher than that, someone whose title wouldn't fit neatly into civilian conversation, someone who'd been waiting 8 years to hear that call sign Guardian was still alive. By 11:24 a.m., the first Marine had arrived at St. Michael's with printed documentation. By noon, Gunnery Sergeant Mercer stood in the hospital lobby reading from Morrison's citation, his voice loud enough to carry through the atrium, loud enough that every medical professional within earshot stopped moving. Captain Laura Bennett, call sign Guardian, 1st Armored Division, awarded the Silver Star for actions under fire in Ramadi where she. Dr. Pierce stormed into the lobby with his hands balled into fists, his voice cutting across Mercer's words with the kind of arrogance that comes from never having been corrected by anything larger than himself. "What circus is happening in my hospital?" The Marine gunnery sergeant turned slowly. Mercer had seen people like Pierce before, people whose authority came from credentials rather than competence, from institutions rather than iron. He didn't bother responding. He just stepped aside. The two-star general in dress uniform walked past Dr. Pierce without acknowledgement, which might have been the kindest thing that happened to him all day. The general moved directly to Laura's surgical recovery bay with Pentagon officials who smelled like classified clearances and government authority. They saluted her decorations. They confirmed codename Guardian had been part of Operation Sandstorm, buried for reasons of national security that would remain classified for another 24 years. They looked at Pierce exactly once, which was all the acknowledgement he would ever receive from anyone in a position of actual power. A junior resident had been filming. She'd gotten it all, the Marine's reading of the citation, the general's salute, the moment Dr. Pierce's face went white as the reality of what he'd done became visible. By 1:15 p.m., the video was on every medical professional's social media feed. By 2:33 p.m., it had 400,000 views. By evening, it had 1.2 million. The comments didn't call her just a nurse anymore. They called her hero. They called her legend. They called her what she'd been the entire time, what they'd all been too blind to see beneath the humility and the clinical precision and the refusal to claim space in rooms that didn't deserve her. Dr. Pierce's phone began ringing at 1:17 p.m. The first call was from the hospital administrator, his voice tight with controlled fury. The second was from the chief of staff, already scheduling an emergency board review. The third was from Dr. Robert Castellano, his medical school mentor, the decorated Vietnam surgeon who'd written the recommendation that had gotten Pierce his residency. Castellano's voice carried the weight of someone who'd actually seen what warfare did to people, who'd stood in field hospitals and held soldiers while they died, who understood exactly what the scars on Laura's back meant. "I saw the video, Richard," Castellano said, and each word sounded like a door closing. "I spent 3 years in Da Nang. I know what that kind of composure costs. And I watched you mock it. I'm withdrawing my recommendation. I'm contacting the board. I'm telling everyone that you're no longer my product." The call disconnected. Pierce sat alone in his office, watching the view counter climb. By week's end, the board review concluded with the termination of his employment, the suspension of his trauma certification, and a formal reprimand in his licensing record. The hospitals stopped calling. The fellowships evaporated. The pharmaceutical company offered him a position as a medical supply coordinator, the kind of job usually reserved for people who'd never quite finished their degrees. 6 months later, Laura Bennett stood in full Army dress uniform at the dedication ceremony for the new VA hospital wing in San Antonio. Her shoulder was healed. Her scars had become permanent. Her name was on the dedication plaque in letters that would last longer than any of them. 143 veterans had shown up the day after the explosion. That number had grown to 847 by the time the wing opened. They'd raised $2.3 million. They'd come because they recognized something in her that the hospital staff had failed to see. Morrison stood beside her in uniform, his chest still bearing the marks of what he'd survived, his voice steady as he spoke about the officer who'd taught him everything before disappearing. When he mentioned her name, half the audience brought their hands to their eyes. Laura stood at the podium for her closing remarks, her voice clear and steady as she looked out at the crowd of veterans who'd come to honor what she'd spent 8 months hiding. Sometimes the bravest warriors carry stethoscopes, not guns. The applause rolled through the room like thunder. Across town, Dr. Pierce loaded boxes into a medical supply van in the pharmaceutical warehouse parking lot, his hand shaking slightly as he signed the invoice clipboard. Through the warehouse window, he could see a television showing footage of the VA dedication ceremony, Laura's face centered in the frame as she shook hands with the governor. He looked away, closed the van doors, and drove toward his first delivery of the day. If you've ever been underestimated, if you've ever hidden who you really are to survive in a space that didn't deserve you, subscribe for more stories about the quiet ones who change everything. Like this video. Comment below, what would you have done in Laura's position? And share this story with someone who needs to know that true class is what you do when the world stops watching.